The first time I realized my in-laws didn't truly respect me, it happened in the middle of a dinner. The table was set immaculately, crystal glasses catching the light, expensive china that seemed more like a stage than a dining set. I had dressed carefully, choosing a modest dress that was elegant without screaming, "Look at me." My husband, Mark, sat across from me, smiling nervously as his mother, Mrs. Hargrove, pinched her lips and whispered to his father. Then she said it out loud, her words cutting sharper than any knife. "Honestly, I don't know why you let her sit here. She doesn't belong in this house." Time seemed to slow. My fork trembled in my hand. I could feel my face heat up, the embarrassment spreading from my chest to my ears. Mark's father, who had always been quiet during these family dinners, merely raised an eyebrow, his silence giving her words more weight. My hands clenched under the table, but I forced a calm smile. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe she was joking or maybe she was. But there was no warmth in her eyes, no hint of humor, just disdain. I wanted to explain myself, to tell her that I was family now, that my presence wasn't a threat, but the words wouldn't come. I watched helplessly as she continued her tirade, mocking the way I spoke, the way I held my glass, even the way I laughed. Each sentence was designed to belittle me, to remind me that, in her eyes, I was beneath them. My husband's quiet nods of apology didn't help, they only emphasized my isolation. That night, I left the dinner with a knot in my stomach, the weight of their judgment pressing on me. I felt small, insignificant, and powerless. But as I lay awake that night, I realized something. Humiliation could be dangerous, but it could also be a weapon. If I wanted respect, I wouldn't ask for it, I would earn it. And not just earn it quietly, I would make it undeniable. Over the next few months, every gathering, every comment, every sideways glance became fuel. My in-laws continued their subtle harassment, criticizing my career, my clothes, my cooking, even the way I managed my home. They assumed that because I was new to the family, because I didn't come from wealth, I was a nobody. They didn't see me. They didn't see what I was capable of. I started tracking their spending, subtle, discreet, nothing that raised suspicion. I learned who handled their bills, their subscriptions, the small, overlooked expenses that kept their lifestyle afloat. And when I realized that many of these expenses could be managed differently, even optimized, an idea started to form in my mind. If they wanted to treat me like I didn't matter, maybe it was time they realized who really held the power. It began innocently enough. I offered to help with a minor payment, a utility bill that had accidentally gone unpaid. They brushed it off with a wave of the hand, assuming I was simply being helpful, eager to please. But I didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I quietly handled more payments. The landscaping, the home security, a few overdue invoices they had forgotten. Always discreetly, always in the background. They didn't notice. They thought it was coincidence, or efficiency from someone else. Meanwhile, I built my own financial independence. I invested in businesses, built a consulting network, and quietly amassed the capital I needed to create leverage. My husband didn't know all the details, and honestly, he didn't need to. This was my own mission, a personal promise that the next time they tried to belittle me, I would have the upper hand. It all came to a head at another family gathering. Mrs. Hargrove, ever sharp-tongued, leaned across the table and made a comment about how lucky my husband was to tolerate me. I could have stayed silent again, like I always had, but this time I smiled. Just a small, knowing smile. She raised an eyebrow, sensing something different, but she didn't know what. Later that evening, as they argued over which vendor to pay first for the garden renovation, I stepped in with calm authority. "I've already handled the payments," I said, handing over receipts and confirmations for the work that had been scheduled. The room froze. Mrs. Hargrove's mouth opened slightly, eyes wide. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Their bills, their expenditures, the very lifestyle they flaunted, they had been quietly supported by me, all along without their knowledge. Mark's father cleared his throat, looking at me with a mixture of astonishment and relief. He had always been polite but never outspoken. Now he was speechless. Mrs. Hargrove, however, was not so easily impressed. She opened her mouth to protest, to assert that I had no right, but I continued, maintaining a calm composure that radiated power. I didn't need to yell or threaten. The numbers spoke for themselves. "You've treated me like a stranger, like I don't belong in this family," I said, my voice steady. "But you've been depending on me all along. Every payment, every arrangement, every inconvenience you thought you were managing, you didn't notice, but I did, and I made sure it was handled." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought she might attack me verbally. But then the realization hit, slowly, like a dawn breaking over a dark horizon. She had underestimated me. She had laughed at me, mocked my ability, dismissed my presence, and yet she had been relying on me in ways she never imagined. The power balance had shifted in silence, and now the truth was undeniable. That night, as the family dispersed, I realized that I hadn't just paid bills. I had bought respect, silently, indirectly. They had believed that status and authority came from wealth alone, but I had shown them that influence could be invisible until revealed at the right moment. And I had learned a lesson myself: power, when wielded thoughtfully and strategically, could never be taken from you. I left that gathering with a quiet sense of victory. I didn't gloat, I didn't flaunt. I simply walked out, knowing that the next time they saw me, they would have to see me differently. And they did. Slowly, grudgingly, but inevitably, the subtle mockery and dismissal faded. They had been challenged but not humiliated publicly. The lesson had been delivered with precision, leaving no room for denial. In that moment, I understood something fundamental about life, family, and power. Respect cannot be demanded, and it cannot be inherited. It must be observed, earned, and sometimes revealed quietly until it becomes undeniable. I had started this journey as a mocked daughter-in-law, but by the time the night ended, I had transformed into someone they could no longer ignore, a hidden force behind the life they thought was theirs alone. And that was only the beginning. The morning after that pivotal family dinner, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt before. I knew my in-laws didn't see me as anything but an outsider, yet they had unknowingly handed me the keys to their influence. It wasn't about revenge, it was about strategy. Every insult, every sideways glance, every whispered comment had become fuel. I decided then that I wouldn't just exist quietly in their world, I would subtly dominate it from the shadows, reshaping the power they thought they owned. I began by reviewing every aspect of their household finances in meticulous detail. Utility bills, subscription services, insurance payments, maintenance schedules, I memorized it all. I created spreadsheets, timelines, and contingency plans. The more I dug, the more I realized how much their lifestyle depended on small, behind-the-scenes actions. Nobody noticed them, nobody appreciated them, but without them, the house would crumble. And all of it was within my control. At first, I started with small interventions. I automated overdue payments so that no late fees would occur, corrected errors that could have caused penalties, and renegotiated contracts quietly to save them money. My husband thought I was merely being helpful, but in reality, I was learning leverage. Each small success reinforced my confidence. It became a game. How many small threads could I pull without anyone realizing I was weaving the entire safety net? Meanwhile, I built my own career with the same relentless focus. I invested in a tech startup my friend had founded, and over the next year I doubled my shares' value. I took on freelance consulting work for local businesses, learning the intricacies of finance, contracts, and client relations. Every dollar I earned was reinvested strategically. I wasn't just saving money, I was building influence, connections, and power. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very people who mocked my ambition were unaware that I was quietly surpassing them in every measurable way. Family gatherings became my laboratory. Each interaction was a lesson in human behavior, observation, and timing. Mrs. Hargrove would often make comments about my spending habits or my simple lifestyle, and I would nod politely, smile, and make no corrections. She thought I was naive or weak, but in truth, I was noting patterns, habits, and vulnerabilities. Every flippant remark she made, every tone of voice, every expression, these became data points I would use later. By the end of the year, I had quietly taken over nearly all financial oversight for their household without anyone noticing. From the gardener to the cleaning service to the minor contractors who fixed the air conditioning, I had my hands in every account. Each time I received an update, I smiled inwardly. They thought I was just being a diligent wife, eager to help. But in reality, I was gaining something far more important: control. And control, when revealed, is more powerful than wealth alone. Then came the turning point. One weekend, Mrs. Hargrove hosted a brunch with extended family, and she naturally began commenting on her worries. A missed payment here, a forgotten renewal there. I casually mentioned that I had handled everything. She waved it off, clearly uninterested in taking credit for herself or acknowledging me, but I had planted seeds. I began to hint at small discrepancies she might have missed, carefully allowing her to see that someone was managing the household efficiently, without revealing that it was me. Her confidence in her own abilities started to waver. I also cultivated my professional image with precision. I began attending networking events, quietly building a reputation as someone who could solve problems others couldn't. I didn't flaunt my wealth or success. Instead, I positioned myself as competent, reliable, and discreet. The irony was delicious. While they mocked my simple life, I was quietly building a foundation strong enough to support not just myself, but their entire lifestyle if needed. Months passed, and their reliance on me grew, though they had no idea. Mrs. Hargrove began asking for my advice on vendors and payments, believing it was casual guidance. My husband started noticing that I was handling more and more of the household logistics and seemed impressed by my efficiency, but he still didn't know the full scope. I kept my strategy subtle, measured, and invisible. One wrong move, one slip, and they would have realized I wasn't just a helpful wife, I was in control. And then the ultimate test arrived. The family decided to renovate part of the estate. It was a complex project, involving multiple contractors, budgets, and deadlines. Mrs. Hargrove began micromanaging the process, questioning every contractor's competence and expressing frustration over costs. I volunteered to oversee it, of course, framing it as helpful guidance. But in reality, I assumed full operational control, negotiating contracts, verifying payments, and keeping every process on schedule. When the renovation finished ahead of schedule and under budget, the family was thrilled. Mrs. Hargrove, still unaware that I had handled the finances and logistics, took partial credit publicly. Internally, however, she had to acknowledge, without admitting it, that the household was running more smoothly than ever. She was beginning to realize, subconsciously, that I wasn't just competent, I was indispensable. By this point, my influence extended far beyond the household. I had investments in multiple companies, a growing professional network, and full control over my husband's family finances. I had quietly turned the tables. The in-laws who had mocked me, who had dismissed me as a simple, unimportant wife, were now dependent on my decisions for their comfort and stability. I still remember the first time Mrs. Hargrove hesitated before giving me a directive. It was subtle, a pause, a brief flicker of uncertainty, but it was significant. For the first time, she saw me not as someone beneath her, but as someone she had underestimated. That tiny crack in her confidence told me that the strategy was working, that I had begun to reshape the family dynamic without confrontation or drama. By the end of Chapter 2, the lesson was clear. Power is most effective when wielded quietly, invisibly, and consistently. I didn't need to argue, threaten, or assert myself aggressively. I had built influence through competence, foresight, and strategic action. The family had laughed at me, mocked my simplicity, and treated me like a stranger, but I had positioned myself in a place they could not ignore. And the final act, the reveal, was coming. The moment when all the invisible power I had quietly amassed would become undeniable. When Mrs. Hargrove and the rest of the family would finally understand that the person they had treated like a trivial outsider was, in fact, the backbone of their own household. The countdown had begun. The morning of the big reveal arrived like any other, but I felt a surge of anticipation I hadn't experienced in years. The air in the house was filled with the usual routine, maids bustling, contractors coming and going, and my husband sipping his coffee as if nothing extraordinary was about to happen. They still had no idea that the person they had treated like an outsider, like a simple, helpful wife, was quietly the one who had kept everything running flawlessly. Today, that would change. I started with small, calculated interactions. Mrs. Hargrove came into the kitchen complaining about an overdue utility notice she had received in the mail. Normally, she would have thrown the letter aside in frustration, but I calmly explained that it had been paid weeks ago and showed her a digital record. Her face twisted from confusion to surprise as she realized she had missed it entirely. The first seeds of doubt had been planted. Next came the contractors. The renovations on the second wing of the house had uncovered some discrepancies in the billing. I called the contractor personally, quietly corrected the invoices, and ensured the project stayed under budget. Later, I casually mentioned to my husband and mother-in-law that everything had been handled, leaving them stunned that no delays or extra costs had occurred. They began to sense, without fully understanding, that I was more involved than they had ever imagined. The real moment of power came during the family meeting. Mrs. Hargrove had gathered everyone to discuss the finances for the upcoming holidays. I joined the discussion quietly, keeping my tone neutral and my demeanor calm. As she outlined the budget, I subtly corrected errors in her calculations, suggested improvements to savings, and highlighted areas where she had mismanaged the funds. Each correction was small, polite, and precise, but it was enough to make her pause repeatedly. By mid-morning, whispers started circulating. My husband leaned over and whispered, "How do you know all this?" I smiled lightly. "I've been paying attention," I said as if it were casual. But inside, I felt a rush of vindication. Every remark they had made about my supposed simplicity, every insult, every doubt, they had underestimated me completely. And now, they were beginning to see that their comfort and stability rested entirely in my hands. That afternoon, I orchestrated another reveal. The household bills, which had always been paid quietly and efficiently, were compiled into a single report. I placed the documents in the living room where the family could see them and called everyone into a casual meeting. I've taken the liberty of organizing everything, I said, keeping my voice calm, even as my heart raced. Here's a complete picture of all expenses, payments, and upcoming commitments. Mrs. Hargrove picked up the report first. Her hands trembled slightly as she leafed through the pages. She looked up at me, eyes wide, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. I don't understand, she stammered. I thought I was managing all of this. Her voice trailed off as the reality began to sink in. The careful, invisible work I had been doing for months, years, was finally visible. I continued, keeping the tone neutral, even conversational. Every bill has been paid on time. Contracts have been renegotiated to reduce costs. Services have been streamlined. And all of this has been documented so that there are no surprises. I watched as their astonishment grew. They had never considered that someone could manage everything so quietly and efficiently without needing recognition, and now they were forced to face the truth. The moment reached its peak when I casually mentioned the mortgage payments. By the way, I said, as if it were trivial, the mortgage is fully covered through the end of next year. Mrs. Hargrove's mouth fell open. You're telling me you've been paying the mortgage, she whispered, disbelief coloring her voice. My husband's eyes widened, his brow furrowing as he finally grasped the full scope of what had been happening behind the scenes. I nodded slowly, letting the tension build. Yes, all expenses have been covered, ensuring the house, utilities, and ongoing projects are fully secure. No bills have been missed. The room was silent. The servants and staff who had quietly witnessed my careful coordination over the months looked on with a subtle acknowledgement of my authority. For the first time, the in-laws realized that their comfort, their very lifestyle, depended on the person they had dismissed, mocked, and treated like a stranger. Then came the strategic flourish, a discussion about upcoming renovations. They began suggesting contractors, materials, and ideas. I calmly outlined a plan that improved efficiency, reduced costs, and avoided common pitfalls. Each suggestion was backed by meticulous research, vendor quotes, and a timeline. Mrs. Hargrove and my husband both stared, speechless. It was no longer just about finances, it was about competence and vision. The person they had laughed at, who had seemed simple, had orchestrated an entire household strategy that surpassed their expectations. By late afternoon, the final revelation unfolded naturally. A longtime family friend called to inquire about contributions for the holiday gala. I picked up the phone, confirmed the donations, and mentioned casually that everything had been arranged and funded in advance. My husband nearly dropped the phone. You handled all of this, he said, disbelief heavy in his voice. Mrs. Hargrove, standing behind him, was pale, her hand clutching her chest. The realization hit them fully when I began to discuss long-term financial planning. I've also consolidated all accounts and investments, I said casually, as though it were a minor detail. This ensures future stability for the household and allows for seamless management of all upcoming expenses. The weight of my words sank in. They were finally beginning to comprehend that the person they had mocked as insignificant was now in complete control, not out of malice, but out of foresight, intelligence, and relentless determination. By the end of the day, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The family no longer saw me as the outsider. They were aware that I had orchestrated and sustained the very life they had taken for granted. The quiet power I had amassed was now undeniable. The respect they had denied me, the recognition they had withheld, was finally evident, without me having to raise my voice or demand it. I stepped back and observed the room. Their expressions ranged from shock to disbelief to a subtle, grudging admiration. Mrs. Hargrove avoided my gaze, as if she were acknowledging silently that she had underestimated me in every possible way. My husband, still processing, finally muttered, I didn't realize how much you were doing. I smiled softly. Now you do. In that moment, the tables had turned completely. I had proven that power is often invisible until revealed, that competence and strategy can outweigh arrogance and entitlement. They had invited me as a participant in their household, but I had become the architect of their stability, the unseen hand guiding every detail. And as I watched them absorb this truth, I knew the final act, the ultimate confirmation of my authority, was still ahead. The in-laws would never see it coming. The moment when the person they dismissed would become the undeniable center of control, proving that patience, strategy, and silent determination could accomplish more than confrontation ever could. The following morning, I walked into the house with a calm certainty. The subtle tremors of the previous day's revelations were still echoing through the walls. My husband and mother-in-law moved about cautiously, as if afraid that a wrong word or glance might reveal how much I truly controlled. I smiled to myself. They had no idea that the ultimate confirmation of my influence was about to unfold. I started with a routine check of the accounts. Normally, they would have attempted to insert themselves, offering helpful suggestions or questioning minor details. But today, I noticed something different, a hesitation, a careful pause before any comment. I realized that the invisible boundaries I had created were now firmly in place. They had begun to understand that I was not just managing finances, I owned the systems that kept their world functioning. Then came the conversation that would seal the transformation. Mrs. Hargrove entered my study, trying to maintain composure, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. I need to understand, she said, voice wavering, how you've been managing everything without our knowledge. Why didn't you tell us? I gestured to the neatly organized spreadsheets and digital records on my desk. I wanted to ensure stability before revealing anything. It's not about secrecy, it's about responsibility. Had I told you before, you might have interfered or underestimated the work required. Her lips pressed into a thin line. But we, your in-laws, should have been aware. We thought we were managing this household. I leaned back in my chair, letting the calm authority in my tone underscore the reality of the situation. You thought you were managing, yes. But management without oversight, without precision, is just chaos. Every payment, every bill, every project was executed according to exact plans. And that's why everything remained smooth. Next, I brought my husband into the conversation. I could see the internal struggle on his face, the mix of disbelief, guilt, and dawning respect. You knew, he asked quietly. I nodded. Every step of the way, the mortgage, utilities, renovations, donations, all handled. I ensured the house remained secure, functional, and even profitable in some areas. Every bill you've ever received was paid because I prioritized the household's stability over ego or recognition. He swallowed hard. I never realized. The words were barely audible, yet they carried the weight of acknowledgement I had been waiting for years to hear. The room was silent except for the subtle hum of the computers and the faint clatter of the distant kitchen staff. For the first time, my husband and mother-in-law were fully aware that their comfort, their lifestyle, and their reputation rested on my competence. The ultimate moment came when I unveiled the legal confirmation of control over the household accounts and investments. I handed over a folder containing detailed account statements, legal documents, and verified contracts that demonstrated my authority. Their eyes widened as they processed the evidence, each page building an undeniable narrative. The person they had dismissed, mocked, and underestimated was the one holding the reins. Mrs. Hargrove gasped, clutching the papers as if they were fragile. You've been managing everything, all of it, she whispered. I nodded calmly. Yes, and moving forward I will continue to manage it, but this time with full transparency and authority. The household operates under my guidance, and all major decisions pass through me. My husband's posture shifted subtly, the old arrogance and casual disregard were gone. He seemed smaller, humbled, and yet I saw a spark of admiration in his eyes. You've done more than I ever imagined, he admitted. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of recognition, respect, and most importantly, surrender to the reality of my authority. The power dynamics in the house shifted visibly that afternoon. Tasks previously micromanaged or questioned were now deferred to me without hesitation. Contractors sought my approval first. Staff approached me confidently for guidance. Even Mrs. Hargrove, who had prided herself on her household control, deferred to my judgment. The person she had once mocked as insignificant had become the linchpin of their entire world. Later, during dinner, I allowed a subtle demonstration of my influence. I suggested minor improvements to the table arrangement, lighting, and meal schedule, details previously dismissed by my husband and mother-in-law. Each suggestion was met with silent compliance. The quiet obedience, the shift from skepticism to acknowledgement, was intoxicating. The atmosphere had transformed. I was no longer the background figure. They were fully aware that their world operated under my supervision. But I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or demand recognition. The power I wielded was silent, strategic, and undeniable. They had learned, through observation and experience, that underestimating me had been a mistake. The house functioned flawlessly, the accounts were impeccable, and the once mocking in-laws had no choice but to respect my authority. The final confirmation arrived a few weeks later. A major household emergency, a sudden repair crisis in the main waterline occurred. Normally, such situations would have caused panic or chaos, but I handled it smoothly, coordinating contractors, negotiating costs, and ensuring that all repairs were completed within hours. My husband and mother-in-law watched in stunned silence as I orchestrated the resolution. No one else had to lift a finger. The realization hit them fully. I had not just been managing, I had been running everything silently, efficiently, and masterfully. By the end of that month, the transformation was complete. The in-laws no longer questioned decisions, they no longer dismissed my opinions, and they no longer underestimated my abilities. I had earned their respect, authority, and most importantly, control. The person they had mocked, treated like an outsider, and ignored had become the cornerstone of their household and the ultimate architect of its success. I finally allowed myself a quiet moment of satisfaction. Sitting in my study, watching the household function smoothly, I reflected on the journey. Every insult, every dismissal, every doubt had been fuel for my determination. I had demonstrated that patience, strategic action, and silent competence could accomplish far more than confrontation or anger ever could. And as I watched the in-laws move through the house, now respectful, now aware, now understanding, I realized the final lesson was not just about control or power. It was about proving that true strength lies in preparation, intelligence, and the quiet confidence to know your worth. They had treated me like a stranger, but now they would never forget who held the reins.